My grandmother left my daughter $240,000. My mother found out 3 days after the funeral, and within the hour, she was standing in my kitchen telling me that if I ever told my daughter about that money, I would ruin her. She used that word specifically. Ruin. Like a fortune was a disease you could catch, and my 8-year-old was already too fragile to survive exposure to it. I nodded. I said I understood. I did not tell her what I was already planning. That was 2 years ago. Last Tuesday at my daughter's school awards ceremony, the kind of event where parents sit in folding chairs and clap for certificates and try not to cry, the lawyer walked in. Not my mother's lawyer. My grandmother's lawyer. He was carrying a leather folder and he was looking directly at me, and my mother was 3 chairs to my left watching the same entrance, and I watched the color drain from her face the way water leaves a bathtub. Slow, then all at once. I stood up slowly. I smoothed my dress. I turned to face the room, the parents, the teachers, the principal near the door, my daughter up front with her class, fidgeting with the ribbon on her certificate the way she always does when she's nervous, and I said, "Before everyone here, I need to tell my daughter something about her future. Something she should have known a long time ago." The lawyer handed her the check. But to understand why that moment was the most important of my daughter's life, and honestly of mine, you need to understand what the 2 years before it actually looked like. Let me tell you how we got here. My name is Nora Scott, and I have exactly one living grandmother. Had. Her name was Celestine Ackafer, and she was my father's mother, biological, blood, the woman who taught me to make jollof rice and reminded me every single time I saw her that I had her hands. She died in October of 2023 at 81 years old, which meant she had watched my entire life and made decisions accordingly. My mother is Diane Scott, née Hargrove, biological, blood, my father's widow, and the person who decided, the moment Celestine was gone, that she was now in charge of everything Celestine had left behind in spirit if not in law. My daughter's name is Zoe. She is 10 now. She was 8 when Celestine died. She called her great-grandmother Grandma Tyne, and she cried for 2 weeks after the funeral, and she still sometimes says things like, "Grandma Tyne would have liked this movie," in a completely matter-of-fact way that breaks my heart every single time. Zoe is my only child, and her father, my ex-husband, Trevor Ash, has been reliably absent since she was 3 years old in ways that are his problem and not this story. I need to be very clear about one relationship before I continue, because it is the whole engine of this situation. Diane Scott is Zoe's maternal grandmother. She is not Celestine's daughter. She is not related to Celestine by blood or by law. She is related to Celestine only through me, through the marriage of my parents, and my father has been dead since I was 26. Diane had no legal claim to anything Celestine left. Zero. She knew this. That knowledge is, I think, the source of everything that followed. Celestine had 3 children, my father Joseph, who died young, my Aunt Renata, who lives in Houston and minds her own business with impressive consistency, and my Uncle Kofi, who has been estranged from the family for reasons predating me. The estate was handled accordingly. But Celestine had also been keeping a separate eye on her grandchildren, which included me and my brother Desmond and 4 cousins I see twice a year at most. And most significantly, she had been watching Zoe. She told me once, maybe a year before she died, that she wanted to make sure Zoe had something that nobody could make contingent on behavior. Her word. Contingent. She said, children should have things that belong to them outright, not as rewards. I did not know then that she had already taken steps to make that happen. I found out the same day as everyone else, 3 days after the funeral, at the reading of the will with my Aunt Renata and a handful of cousins and my mother, who had no business being there at all, but who showed up because she had driven me, and I had been too sad and too tired to object. The attorney at the reading was Gerald Whitfield of Whitfield and Brower in our city, a thin man in his late 60s, who read the document with the flat affect of someone who had done this 10,000 times and had long ago stopped assigning emotional weight to other people's money. When he got to the section regarding Zoe, he paused just slightly before reading, the way you do when you already know a particular number is going to shift the air in a room. He stated it clearly. $240,000 to be held in trust for Zoe Ann Ash, my daughter's legal surname from her father, with me designated as trustee until her 25th birthday. My mother made a sound I had never heard from her before, not a word, a sound, like something had knocked the air out of her unexpectedly from behind. Renata, sitting 2 chairs down, turned to look at me. I looked back at her. She gave the smallest nod I have ever seen, barely a millimeter, just enough to say, I knew. Celestine had told her. She had kept it. My mother said nothing for the rest of the reading. She drove me home in complete silence. Then she pulled into my driveway, turned off the engine, and said, "You cannot tell Zoe about this. Not now, not when she is this age. I have seen what happens to children who grow up knowing they have money coming. They stop trying. They get entitled. They stop respecting what things cost. She will be ruined." I sat with that word for a moment. Ruined. My 8-year-old, ruined by the knowledge that her great-grandmother had loved her enough to set aside a future for her. I said I understood. I got out of the car. I watched her drive away. Then I went inside, kissed my daughter on the top of her head, asked her how school was, and later that night, after she was asleep, I sat at my kitchen table and thought about what my grandmother had actually asked me to do. Celestine had named me trustee. Not Diane, not any committee. Me. She had trusted me with both the money and the timing. And in that trust was an implicit permission that my mother was trying, right now, to take from me. Here is what you need to understand about Diane Scott to understand why I went quiet and stayed quiet for as long as I did. My mother is not a cruel person. She is a frightened one. She grew up without money in a way that left marks that never fully healed, and those marks express themselves as control. If she can manage how resources flow, and who knows what and who has access to what, she feels safe. My father's death when I was 26 hit her harder than anyone acknowledged, because he had been, for 30 years, the person who provided the structure she needed to feel okay. When he died, she transferred that management impulse to me and to Zoe, the two remaining people she was closest to. I know all of this. I have known it for a long time, and it did not make what she asked me to do correct. But it made me understand that fighting her directly, in the raw weeks after Celestine's funeral, when everyone was grief-sore and exhausted, was not going to end in a way that served Zoe. My mother is not someone who loses gracefully. She is someone who regroups and comes back with more leverage, more guilt, more history on her side. If I fought her in October of 2023, she would spend the next 18 months making my life and Zoe's life harder in ways I wouldn't be able to point to directly: canceled plans, loaded comments, the thousand small withdrawals of warmth that a grandmother controls like a thermostat. Zoe adored her. The last thing I wanted was for my daughter's grief to be compounded by a war she didn't understand. So I said I understood. And then I did something I didn't tell my mother about. 3 weeks after the will reading, I made an appointment with an estate attorney named Lena Cardoso at a firm downtown that had been recommended to me by a colleague. I told her everything. The will, the trust, the amount, my designation as trustee. My mother's demand. I asked Lena to explain to me clearly what my legal obligations were as trustee, and what, if anything, required me to tell Zoe or to keep silent. Lena reviewed the trust documents carefully, a process that took most of our 2-hour meeting, and when she looked up from the pages, she said, "Your obligation is to act in the beneficiary's best interest." That's it. That's the whole job. There is no clause requiring disclosure to an 8-year-old. There is also nothing, and she was clear about this, nothing that gives any third party the authority to direct how you manage this trust. Not a grandmother, not an aunt, not a parent. You are the trustee, you decide. She also said one other thing, almost as an aside, that I have thought about nearly every day since. She said, "The money has already been growing since the date of death, Nora. Your grandmother was meticulous about this. The trust was structured to keep working. The longer the principal sits, the more it compounds. Zoe at 25 will have more than Zoe at 8 would have had. That may be relevant to your thinking. It was. I paid Lena's fee, kept our first appointment off any paperwork my mother might see. She had a habit of commenting on my bank statements when she visited, a habit I had never successfully ended, and I drove home feeling something I had not expected to feel. Calm. Specific, informed, professional calm. If you have ever been counted out by someone who should have known better, you know exactly what that silence feels like. Not passive, not resigned. Strategic. My mother thought I was complying. I was managing. The first time I understood how difficult this arrangement was going to be was 6 months after the will reading, in April of 2024. My mother had come for dinner. She did this every other Sunday, a routine that predated the inheritance situation and that I had decided not to disrupt, because disruption would signal something had changed between us. Over pasta, she brought up a conversation she had apparently had with Celestine's attorney Gerald Whitfield, which she introduced so casually I almost missed how strange it was that she had contacted him at all. She said, "I spoke to the estate attorney about the trust structure. Just to understand how it works." She picked up her wine glass. I asked him a few questions about oversight. I set my fork down, not slowly, just down. "What kind of oversight questions?" She smiled at Zoe, who was eating with her elbows on the table and completely uninterested in adult conversation. "Just administrative things, sweetheart, nothing to concern yourself with." After dinner, after Zoe was in bed, I asked my mother directly what she had asked Gerald Whitfield. She said she had asked whether there were any provisions for a secondary review of trustee decisions, whether another family member could request an accounting. And what did he say? He said the trust is quite clear. She picked up her purse from the couch in the way she does when she's preparing to leave, holding it by the strap, not yet putting it on, buying herself options. I just wanted to understand the structure. "Mom," I waited until she looked at me. "I am managing Zoe's trust exactly the way Grandma Tyne would have wanted. You don't need to verify that with an outside attorney." She patted my arm. "Of course not, sweetheart. I was just curious." She put her coat on. "Get some sleep, you look tired." After she left, I called Lena Cardoso the next morning. I told her about my mother's contact with Whitfield. Lena was quiet for a moment, then said, "That's an interesting move. She can't actually do anything through Whitfield. He represented the estate, not the trust, and the trust is yours to manage. But it tells us she's looking for a way in. I'd suggest we document everything from here." She recommended I start keeping dated notes of every conversation where the trust or the money came up, not for any immediate purpose, but as a record. She also mentioned, and I wrote this down, "You are not required to tell your mother anything about how the trust is invested or managed. You may choose to share information as a courtesy, but it is never obligatory." I bought a small notebook that afternoon. Nothing special, just a dark green spiral notebook from the drugstore. I wrote the date on the first page, and I wrote down everything my mother had said at dinner and on the phone, as close to verbatim as I could remember it. I did this every time after that. Within 8 months, I had 47 pages. The second incident that mattered came in the fall of 2024, about a year after the will reading, right around the anniversary of Celestine's death. Zoe had asked me that week, out of nowhere, the way kids do, whether Grandma Tyne had left anything to her. She had been at school, and apparently they had talked about family trees and what gets passed down, and she came home full of the specific focused energy of a child who has just learned a new concept and wants to apply it everywhere. I told her that Grandma Tyne had loved her very much and had thought very carefully about her future. Zoe thought about this for a second, then said, "But did she leave me anything real?" I said, "What do you think real means?" She thought about it seriously, the way she does. Then she said, "Something you can hold or something that helps." I said, "Something that helps." Yes, she did. Zoe seemed satisfied with this. She went back to her homework. I went to my room and sat on the edge of my bed for about 4 minutes. That conversation went into the green notebook too. What I did not know until 3 weeks later was that Zoe had repeated this exchange, probably word for word, because she has an extraordinary memory for exact phrasing, to my mother during a Sunday visit when I was in the kitchen and they were watching television in the living room. My mother told me about it herself, not as a complaint exactly, but as a warning. She said, "Zoe asked me about the inheritance." I said, "What did you tell her?" I told her that Grandma Tyne left her something special that she would understand when she was older. "That's fine. Nora," she set her tea down, "you told her something. She used the word helps." I told her that Celestine thought about her future. "That is completely true. You are opening a door." Her voice was very even. She does even when she is not calm. She learned it from decades of emotional management. "I am asking you to keep it closed." I looked at her for a moment. She was sitting very straight, both hands around her mug, watching me with the expression she uses when she believes she is being reasonable and needs me to agree. "I hear you," I said. She nodded. She picked her tea back up. "Good." The door was already open. She just couldn't see it from where she was sitting. That night, I reviewed the trust documents again, the full original packet that Gerald Whitfield had provided, which I kept in a locked fireproof box on the top shelf of my closet. Lena had already helped me go through it once in detail, but I went through it again myself, slowly, looking at every clause. The trust was elegantly drafted. Celestine had been meticulous, as Lena had said. The principal amount. The investment vehicle, a diversified managed account at a firm called Hargrove Institutional, which I found slightly funny given my mother's maiden name, though they were not related. The terms of my trusteeship. The provision for Zoe's access at 25, with a provision for earlier access for qualified educational expenses at my discretion as trustee. That last clause, I had not focused on it before. I focused on it now. Educational expenses at trustee's discretion. I called Lena the following week. I asked her what qualified as educational expenses under the terms of the trust. She walked me through the definitions. Tuition, yes. Books, yes. Educational programs, yes. A 529 account, if I wanted to preposition funds for college, yes. I could authorize a transfer as trustee and establish a separate college savings vehicle if I chose to. I asked her to help me do exactly that. In January of 2025, I authorized a transfer from the trust and established a 529 college savings account for Zoe, in her name, with me as custodian. The amount was $65,000, a meaningful portion of the principal, positioned now in an account designed to grow specifically toward educational use, with its own tax advantages. This was fully within my authority as trustee. It was also the kind of move that a trustee makes not just for financial benefit, but to demonstrate documented, consistent intention to serve the beneficiary's interests. Lena reviewed the paperwork before and after. Everything was clean, dated, and on file. I told my mother none of this. She came for dinner the following Sunday with a casserole she had made from scratch, and she sat at my table and told me she was glad we understood each other about Zoe and the inheritance, and she said it in the warm tone of someone who believes the matter is settled. I refilled her water glass. I asked about her garden. I listened to her talk about a new perennial she had planted. She told me, almost as an aside, that she had been thinking about Zoe's future, about how important it would be for Zoe to understand the value of working for things, of building something herself. She said, "The worst thing for a child is to grow up expecting a windfall." I said, "Zoe works very hard. You've always said so yourself." She smiled. "She does, because she doesn't know." I nodded slowly. In my closet upstairs, in a locked fireproof box, sat $65,000 worth of documented intention that said, "She will know. At exactly the right moment, she will know everything. And by then, it will already be done." Lena had given me one other piece of advice in our January meeting, almost as a closing thought, the way she tended to drop the most important things, casually, as though they were obvious. She said, "Trust anniversaries matter for administration purposes. The 2-year mark often triggers a formal accounting report from the investment manager. It is routine and mandatory. The report goes to the trustee to you, but it is also, depending on the trust language, sometimes copied to the named estate attorney as a compliance matter." She looked at me over her reading glasses. "Gerald Whitfield will likely receive a copy in October." I asked what that meant practically. "It means," she said, "that by October of 2025, there will be a formal, documented record of how this trust has been administered. Every decision you made, every transfer, every communication on file." She closed her folder. "Make sure the record says what you want it to say." I spent the next 9 months making sure of exactly that. By September of 2025, I had 47 documented trust-related decisions or conversations in the green notebook. I had a clean 529 account with $65,000 and 14 months of growth. I had a trustee file that Lena described, after reviewing it, as the most organized client documentation she had seen in 3 years of estate practice. And I had a daughter who was now 10 years old, who still called her great-grandmother Grandma Tyne when she remembered her, who had won 3 academic achievement certificates at school, who had absolutely no idea what was sitting in her name, growing quietly, the way her great-grandmother had intended. I had not lied to my daughter. I had not told her everything. There is a difference between those two things, and I had lived in that difference for 2 years. I had also not lied to my mother. I had simply not contradicted her assumption that everything was still in holding, still waiting, still contingent on her comfort level with the timing. She was not the trustee. That was never her call to make. By the first week of October, I had received the 2-year accounting report from Hargrove Institutional. I had reviewed it twice. The original principal, invested and managed for 24 months, had grown. The 529 was performing well. Everything that Celestine had set in motion was still in motion, still compounding, still waiting for the moment I decided was right. And then the call from Gerald Whitfield's office came. His assistant called me on a Wednesday afternoon in the second week of October. Zoe was at school, I was at my desk, and the number came through as a downtown law office, and I answered knowing, immediately, what it was going to be about. The assistant said Mr. Whitfield would like to schedule a meeting at my earliest convenience to discuss the 2-year trust administration review and certain formalities related to the next phase of trust management. She said it in the pleasant, neutral voice of someone conveying routine administrative information. I asked when Mr. Whitfield was available. She gave me 3 options. I chose the earliest one. I called Lena from the car 10 minutes later. I said, Whitfield's office called. They want a meeting. She said, I know. He called me as well. She paused. Nora, are you ready? I thought about my daughter's school award ceremony, which was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I thought about the certificate she had already told me she was going to win with the particular confidence of a child who is right. I thought about my mother's seat, 3 chairs to my left, and what her face would look like. I have been ready, I said, for about 23 months. Lena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, good. Let's talk about how this goes. The meeting with Gerald Whitfield was the following Friday morning. Lena met me in the lobby of his office building 10 minutes before the appointment, which was her way. She was always early, always composed, always already 2 moves ahead of wherever the conversation was. She was carrying the full administrative file, tabbed and organized, along with printed copies of the 529 documentation and the complete trustee record. She handed me a copy when we were in the elevator. You don't need to say much, she said. The file says it. Gerald Whitfield was exactly as I remembered him from the will, reading, thin, measured, unhurried. He shook my hand and gestured to the chairs across from his desk and poured water without asking. He set the accounting report in front of me and walked through it with the same flat affect I remembered, pausing at each line item the way a professor pauses at equations that require the students to catch up. When we reached the section regarding trustee decisions and the 529 transfer, he stopped. He looked at the paperwork Lena had provided. He picked up his pen and made a small notation in the margin of his copy, the kind of notation you make when you are confirming that a thing was done correctly. Everything appears to be in excellent order, he said. It is, Lena said, pleasantly. Whitfield looked at me. Your grandmother was very specific in her instructions about the trust and its management. She also left me with one additional instruction, which I was directed to execute at the 2-year mark, contingent on the trust being in good standing. He opened his desk drawer and took out an envelope, plain, cream-colored, sealed. This is a letter from Celestine Ackhafer. She asked that I deliver it in person to you at this meeting. He slid it across the desk. I picked it up. It was lighter than I expected. I could feel through the envelope that there was a single folded page inside and something smaller, stiff, rectangular. She also asked, Whitfield said, with something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one, that you share the contents with your daughter at whatever moment you judged appropriate. Those were her words, whatever moment you judged appropriate. I set the envelope in my lap. My hands were very still. She trusted you, he said simply. I did not open the envelope in his office. I waited until I was in the parking garage, in my car, with the engine off and Lena sitting in the passenger seat. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single page in my grandmother's handwriting, which I recognized immediately, and which is one of the most specific things I know how to miss about her. The way she formed her capital letters with a slight forward lean, like they were walking somewhere. And inside the folded page was a check, written in Celestine's hand, made out to Zoe Ann Ash, dated October of 2023, the month she died. The amount, written out in her careful handwriting, $240,000, not a wire, not a transfer, a check in her actual handwriting. Lena looked at it and said, quietly, she wanted Zoe to have something physical, something that came from her hand. I folded the check back into the letter. I held it in both hands for a moment. The letter itself was 4 paragraphs. I went through it there, in the parking garage, with the fluorescent lights humming above us and Lena sitting perfectly still next to me in the way she does when she understands that her job in a given moment is simply to be present. I will not repeat everything Celestine wrote. It was for me and for Zoe, but the last sentence was, tell her when the time is right and trust yourself to know when that is. You have always known. I wiped my eyes once, put the letter in my bag, and said to Lena, her school awards ceremony is Tuesday. Lena looked at me. Is your mother going to be there? She's planning to. She comes to all of Zoe's school events. A pause. Do you want me to attend? I thought about that for exactly 3 seconds. Yes, I said, I do. I did not call my mother that weekend. I did not call her Sunday, even though it was a dinner Sunday, and I told her by text that Zoe had a project due and I was helping and we would catch up after the ceremony. She sent back a thumbs up emoji, which she only does when she is mildly annoyed but doesn't want to say so. I spent that Sunday evening doing 2 things. First, I read Zoe the first part of Celestine's letter, not the financial details, not yet, but the paragraphs about love and intention and why a grandmother makes plans for the people she loves. Zoe listened with the focused stillness she has when something matters to her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Did Grandma Tyne write that?" I said yes. She said, "Can I keep it?" I said, "It was written for you. You'll get the whole thing soon." She looked at me with the expression she has when she is measuring something, calculating whether to ask the next question. She has had that look since she was about 5. Then she said, "Is the something that helps what she wrote about?" I said, "Yes." She nodded once, seriously, and went back to her book. The second thing I did that Sunday was sit down and think carefully about what I was going to say in that gymnasium, if everything landed the way I expected it to. Not rehearsed, exactly. I do not do well with scripts, and this was not a moment for a speech. It was a moment for the truth, simply told, in front of everyone who had spent 2 years assuming I was managing this situation the way they wanted me to. By Monday night, I had not written a word down, but I knew exactly what I was going to say. The ceremony was at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. The school gymnasium, which doubled as the auditorium, had been set up with rows of folding chairs for parents and a small stage at the front where the principal and 2 teachers would stand. The kids sat in rows facing the stage, parents behind them. There were about 40 families, maybe 90 people total when you counted siblings and grandparents who had come along. My mother arrived at 1:45, which was 15 minutes before me, which meant she had already selected her seat and established territorial presence by the time I walked in with Zoe, who was wearing a blue dress and carrying her backpack and already scanning the room for her best friend. My mother was in the 5th row on the left side. She had saved the seat next to her for me by placing her coat over it, which she does at every school event. I sat down next to her and told her she looked nice, which she did. She was wearing a green blazer I had given her for her birthday 2 years ago and her good pearl earrings, which she reserves for events she considers significant. She patted my hand and pointed toward the front, where the kids were filing in, and said, "There's your girl," in a warm voice that was entirely genuine, because whatever else is complicated about my mother, her love for Zoe has never been complicated at all. And that honestly is the thing that made the next 30 minutes difficult. The principal started the ceremony at 2:05. 3 rows back and 4 seats to the right, I could see Lena, who had dressed exactly right for a school event, a navy blazer, no briefcase, which she had put in the car. She looked like another parent. Nobody would have known. The awards went in alphabetical order by category, which meant academic achievement came early. The principal read from a card, "Zoe and Ash." There was the usual burst of applause, the slightly chaotic shuffle of a 10-year-old navigating through seated classmates, the brief moment on the stage where the teacher hands over the certificate and someone's parent takes 17 photographs. My mother was one of those parents. She had her phone up immediately, both hands, full recording mode, and I watched her face while she filmed, and it was pure uncomplicated pride, the kind you cannot perform. Zoe came back to her seat holding the certificate with both hands, the way she holds things she doesn't want to bend, and she turned around to find us in the rows behind and grinned when she spotted her grandmother filming. My mother lowered her phone. She had actual tears in her eyes, and that is when I saw Lena stand up from her row, quietly, and move toward the aisle. She was not moving toward the exit. She was moving toward the edge of the room where a man was standing, a man I recognized even from 40 feet away, because Gerald Whitfield has a particular quality of stillness that is very specific to estate attorneys of a certain generation. He was in a dark suit. He was carrying the leather folder. He had arrived at some point during the academic awards and positioned himself near the door, and he was waiting. My mother saw him at the same moment I did. I know because her hand, which had been resting on my arm, went very still. She turned to look at me. I looked back at her. "Nora," very quiet. "Who is that?" I stood up. Not quickly. Not urgently. I smoothed my dress the way I do when I am about to do something that requires steadiness, and I stood up fully, and I was aware of a few nearby parents registering the movement and looking up from their phones. The principal had paused between certificates. There was a natural gap in the program. I did not look at my mother again. I looked at the room, at the parents, at the teachers, at the principal near the door who had registered that something was happening at the edge of his event, at my daughter up front with her class, who had turned around in her chair the way kids do when they sense that something adult and serious is occurring, and who was looking at me with that measuring expression. I said, clearly enough to be heard by the rows around me, "Before everyone here, I need to tell my daughter something about her future. Something she should have known a long time ago." Lena walked to the end of Zoe's row and leaned down and said something quietly to the teacher, who nodded and touched Zoe's shoulder. My daughter looked up at Lena, then across the room at me, then back at Lena, and she stood up carefully, holding her certificate, and she walked toward me through the gap between the rows. Gerald Whitfield met her in the aisle. He crouched down to her level, this man in his late 60s in a dark suit, with his leather folder and his decades of estate practice, and he said to my daughter, in the same measured voice I remembered from the will reading, "Your great-grandmother Celestine wanted to make sure you had something that belonged to you outright. She asked me to make sure you received it properly." He opened the folder. He took out the envelope. He held it toward Zoe. Zoe looked at it. Then she looked at me. I nodded once. She took the envelope with both hands, the same way she had held the certificate, careful, not wanting to bend it. She looked at Whitfield. She said, "What is it?" He said, "Open it and see." She looked at me again, and I moved toward her, and she opened the envelope there in the aisle of her school gymnasium, with 40 families around us and her grandmother 3 rows back and Lena standing quietly to one side and her teacher watching from the front, and she unfolded the letter and the check came loose from the pages, and she caught it before it fell. She looked at the check for a long moment. She looked at the handwriting. She said, "This is Grandma Tyne's writing." I said yes. She said, "Why does it have my name on it?" I crouched down next to her, right there in the aisle. I said, "Because Grandma Tyne saved something for you, for your future. She thought about you very carefully, and she made sure you would have something that was yours, that no one could take away, and that would help you become whoever you decide to be. She put it in my care to keep safe until the right time. And this is the right time." Zoe looked at the check for another moment. The number was there in Celestine's handwriting, spelled out, as Celestine always wrote numbers, fully and carefully, the way her generation did. My daughter could read it. She is 10 years old and she is an excellent reader, and she understood what she was looking at. She said, very quietly, "Grandma Tyne did this?" I said, "before she died. She planned it carefully." Zoe held the check and the letter against her chest, both hands flat over them, the way she holds things she wants to keep. Her eyes were bright, but she wasn't crying. She was thinking in that specific, focused way she has. And then she turned around and looked at my mother, who was standing now, 3 rows back, absolutely still. My mother's hand had gone to her pearls. She was gripping the strand at the base of her throat, not pulling at it, just holding it, the way you hold something familiar when everything around you is shifting. Her expression was not the one I had expected. It was not anger. It was not the controlled evenness she uses when she is managing a situation. It was something older and smaller, something that looked, if I am being honest, like grief. She looked at the check in Zoe's hands. Then she looked at me. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. My daughter turned back to me. She said, "Did you know?" I said, "I have been keeping it safe for 2 years, waiting for the right time." She thought about this. Then she said, "The something that helps." I said, "Yes, that's it exactly." She nodded slowly, with the gravity of someone who has just received information that they are going to need to think about for a long time. Then she said, with the practical clarity that is one of my favorite things about her, "Can we go home and look at the letter properly?" With no people around, I said, "Yes, absolutely yes." The principal, who had been watching all of this from the front of the room with the particular expression of a school administrator who has just encountered something entirely outside his standard protocol, cleared his throat gently. Lena caught my eye and tilted her head slightly toward the door, suggesting, professionally and without words, that the rest of the ceremony could proceed without us. I thanked Gerald Whitfield, who shook my hand and said, "She would have been very pleased with how this was managed, Nora." He said it simply as a fact, and I believed him. We left before the rest of the certificates. I kept one hand on Zoe's shoulder and she kept both hands on the envelope. Behind us, in row 5, my mother was still standing. We got to my car before either of us spoke. Zoe climbed into the back seat, still holding the envelope with both hands flat against the front of it, the way you carry something you've decided matters. I got in the driver's seat and sat for a moment without starting the engine, and in the rearview mirror I could see her looking out the window at the school building, thinking. "Mom," she said finally. "Yeah. Is $240,000 a lot?" I turned to look at her directly, not through the mirror. "Yes, it's a lot." She nodded slowly, processing this the way she processes large new things, filing it, tagging it, finding where it fits in the structure she already has. Then she said, "Grandma Tyne saved it herself?" "She did, over a long time." Another pause, then with the practical precision that is so distinctly her. "Is it in a bank?" "It's in a trust, which is kind of like a special bank that's just for you, that I take care of until you're old enough to take care of it yourself." She considered this. "How old?" 25. She looked mildly disappointed, the way a 10-year-old looks when a reward is 15 years away. Then she looked back at the envelope. "Can I read the letter when we get home?" "That's exactly what we're going to do." I started the car. We drove home in the particular quiet of two people who have just had something large happen and are each processing it privately, which is actually one of my favorite kinds of quiet with her. She is not a child who fills silence nervously. She never has been. My phone buzzed twice before we reached the first traffic light. Both times, my mother. I let it go to voicemail. We got home at 3:15 in the afternoon. Zoe changed out of her dress immediately. She does this with anything she considers her good clothes, a habit she developed entirely on her own around age 7 that I find both responsible and slightly funny, and came back downstairs in leggings and a sweatshirt, certificate tucked under her arm, envelope in hand. We sat on the couch together and I let her open the letter fully this time, unfolding it herself, reading Celestine's handwriting carefully the way she reads anything handwritten, with slightly more concentration than print requires. She read the whole thing twice. Then she set it on her lap and looked at the check again and was quiet for a long moment. "She says she wanted me to have something that nobody could make conditional," she said. I looked at her. "You know what that word means?" "It means it doesn't depend on anything. It just is." She looked at me. "Did somebody try to make it conditional?" I thought about how to answer that honestly without placing a 10-year-old in the middle of an adult conflict she had no business carrying. I said, "Someone was worried that knowing about it too soon would be confusing. I was keeping it safe until the right moment." She accepted this. She folded the letter carefully back along its original creases and put it in the check back in the envelope. Then she said, in a slightly different tone, quieter, more considered, "Is Grandma Diane upset? She might be a little surprised." "She was doing the face," Zoe said, "the one where she holds her necklace." I looked at my daughter for a moment. She had cataloged my mother's nervous tell at some point over her 10 years of life and filed it away so precisely that she could name it by category. I said, "When did you notice she does that?" She shrugged. "A while ago. She does it when she doesn't know what to say." A pause. "Should I call her?" "Not today, let me talk to her first." She nodded, satisfied with this as a plan, and went to put the envelope in her room. I heard her open her desk drawer, the same one where she keeps her important school papers and a small jewelry box that had been Celestine's, and I heard the drawer close again. Then I heard her start a video game, which told me she had mentally filed this underhandled and moved on, which is one of the healthiest things about her. I sat on the couch alone for about 4 minutes. Then I picked up my phone and listened to both of my mother's voicemails. The first one was from right after we left the gymnasium. Her voice was very controlled in the specific way she controls it when she is not controlled at all, each word placed carefully, like she was carrying something fragile. She said, "Nora, call me when you can. I think we should talk before things go further than they need to go." The second one was from 11 minutes later. The control had frayed slightly at the edges. She said, "I need to understand what happened today. Please call me. There were things said in front of a great many people, and I don't know where this is going, and I would like to talk to you about it before." She stopped. Then, "Just call me." I did not call her back that evening. I called Lena instead from the kitchen while Zoe was still upstairs, and I told her everything had gone as planned. Lena said she knew, she'd been there, after all, and asked how Zoe was. I told her. Lena was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had the particular warmth it takes on when she steps outside the professional role for a second and is just a person. "Celestine would have loved that kid." I said, "She did love that kid. That's the whole story." Lena said she would follow up with Whitfield's office the following week to ensure all the administrative documentation was in proper order. and that the trust accounting would be updated to reflect the disclosure event and the date of the ceremony as the formal moment of beneficiary notification. Clean, documented, on file. That night I made dinner, helped Zoe with homework, watched 40 minutes of a nature documentary with her, put her to bed, and then sat at my kitchen table with my phone face down in front of me and let myself feel, for just a few minutes, the full weight of what the last 2 years had required. Not triumph, not vindication. Just the specific physical exhaustion of having carried something heavy for a long time and finally being able to set it down. I called my mother at 8:47 in the evening. She picked up on the second ring. Her voice was very quiet. "I've been waiting. I know I needed a couple of hours." A pause, long enough that I could hear her breathing. "What you did today, Nora, in front of all those people. Mom, you could have told me. You could have talked to me first. You didn't have to do it that way." I had thought about how to have this conversation for weeks. Not the words exactly, I don't do scripts, but the shape of it. What needed to be said and what didn't. Where the line was between honest and unkind, and whether, in this specific case, I was willing to stay on the careful side of it. I said, "I am Zoe's trustee. Celestine named me. Not you, not a committee, me. I have been managing that trust correctly and completely for 2 years. Every decision I made is documented. Every one. I know that. Do you?" I kept my voice even. "Because for 2 years, you have been asking me to keep something from my daughter that was hers. Not yours. Not mine to decide, hers. And when you couldn't convince me through conversation, you called Gerald Whitfield to ask about oversight." Silence. "I know about that," I said. "He told Lena, and Lena told me." She made a sound, not a word, just a small intake of breath, the sound of someone recalibrating. "I am not angry with you," I said, and I meant it. "I understand why you did what you did. I understand where it comes from. But I need you to understand that what happened today was not a punishment, and it was not about you. It was about Zoe having the thing that Celestine built for her, delivered the way Celestine intended. Clearly, officially, from her own grandmother's hand." Another pause, longer this time. "She used the actual check," my mother said finally. Her voice had changed, the control was still there, but the edge underneath it had softened into something more like grief. "Celestine's handwriting." "Yes." I didn't know she had written a check. Nobody did, just Whitfield. I heard my mother exhale slowly, then very quietly, "How much has it grown with the trust?" It was such a specific question, so focused on the mechanics of management even in the middle of an emotional conversation that despite everything I almost smiled. "It's in good shape. The 529 is performing well, I've been careful." "I know you have," a beat. Then, "I know you have, Nora." I never doubted that. What she meant was, I doubted the timing, I doubted the disclosure. I doubted whether you would make the same choices I would have made, but not your competence. Never that. This is the thing about my mother that makes her so difficult and so irreplaceable. She is not wrong about her own love. She has never been wrong about that part. "What did Zoe say?" she asked. I told her. The part about something that helps, the part about the letter, the drawer where she put it. By the time I finished, my mother's voice had gone very soft. "She put it in the box." "She did." "Celestine gave her that box." She paused. "For her 7th birthday. I remember." Neither of us said anything for a moment. Outside my kitchen window the neighborhood was quiet, porch lights, one neighbor's dog barking twice then stopping, the particular stillness of a weeknight in October. My mother said, "I think I owe her an apology." I said, "I think she'd like that." "And you?" I thought about that honestly. "I think we're okay, Mom. I think we need to talk more, and I think there are some things that are going to be different going forward. But we're okay." She said goodnight in the voice she uses when she is managing something she doesn't entirely have the words for yet. I said goodnight back. We hung up. I sat in the quiet kitchen for another few minutes. Then I went upstairs, checked that Zoe was asleep. She was, completely, one arm over her face the way she slept since she was a baby, and went to bed myself. That was October of 2025. In the weeks that followed, here is what actually happened. Gerald Whitfield's office sent the complete administrative file to Hargrove Institutional the following week, as required for the 2-year trust review. Everything was in order. Lena received the confirmation and forwarded it to me with a one-line note, "Cleanest trustee file I've seen in years. Celestine picked well." I printed it and put it in the green notebook. The last entry. My mother came for Sunday dinner 2 weeks after the ceremony. She brought Zoe a card, handwritten, which is not my mother's habit. She is a text message person. That said something she had clearly been working on for a while. She gave it to Zoe privately, before dinner, in the living room while I was in the kitchen, and I do not know exactly what it said because it was between them. What I know is that Zoe came into the kitchen afterward and said, "Grandma Diane says she's really proud of me," in the matter-of-fact tone of a child reporting a fact, and then immediately asked what was for dinner. Whatever my mother wrote, it was enough. They watched a movie together after dinner, the two of them on the couch, and when she left, my mother hugged me at the door and held on for a second longer than usual and didn't say anything, which was, honestly, everything. The conversation about oversight and the calls to Whitfield never happened again, not once in the months that followed. I don't know whether it was the ceremony, or the phone call, or simply that she finally understood that the trust was being managed well and that Zoe was fine, thriving actually, and that the thing she had been afraid of had not materialized. Maybe all three. I didn't ask her to explain herself. That wasn't what I needed from her. My Aunt Renata called me the day after the ceremony. She had heard about it through the family network that operates at a speed I have never been able to fully track. She said, "Your grandmother would have stood up and applauded." I believed her. Renata was one of 3 people Celestine had told about the trust before she died, and she had kept the secret so completely that I hadn't even thought to ask her. She said, before she hung up, she knew you'd figure out the right moment. She said you always did. The 529 account, as of January of 2026, had grown to just over $72,000. Zoe does not know the specific number, she's 10, and a number is not what she needs to know right now, but she knows it exists, and she knows it's hers, and she knows it's for school. She has, somewhat unexpectedly, developed a strong interest in how compound interest works, because she asked me to explain it, and then spent 20 minutes asking progressively more technical follow-up questions, until I had to admit that she had reached the edge of what I could explain without a whiteboard. I told her we could ask Lena to explain the rest. She said, "Is Lena the lawyer from the school thing?" I said yes. She said I liked her. She was quiet. Zoe is doing well. She is doing genuinely, straightforwardly well, school, friends, the particular contained happiness of a child who feels secure. She talks about Grandma Tyne sometimes. Not often, and not with sadness exactly, more the way you mention someone who is still part of your life by the things they left in it. She opens her desk drawer sometimes, and I've seen her take out the envelope and just hold it for a moment, not opening it, just knowing it's there. That, I think, is what Celestine actually meant, not the number. The knowing. I am not going to tell you my mother became a different person after October. She didn't. She is still someone who feels safest when she can manage how things flow, and I am still someone who will not be managed, and we are still learning, at this late date in our relationship, how to live in that particular tension without it becoming a wound. But she came to Zoe's school play in December and sat next to me and cried at the same parts I did. She calls on Sundays and sometimes forgets to be careful and is just my mother, and on those nights the calls run long and neither of us notices until it's past 10. I'll take that. That is real and it is enough. The green notebook is in my filing cabinet now. I do not think I will need it again. But I kept it because Celestine taught me that the things you've built are worth keeping a record of, not to prove something to someone else, but to remind yourself, on the days when doubt is louder than evidence, that you knew what you were doing all along. She trusted you, Whitfield said. She was right to. So did I go too far, or not far enough? Tell me in the comments.